Welcome to GS Podcast number 117. I'm Stephen Knight. How are you? Good? Good. Making good on my promise to bring you more content this year based around innovation and technology. I'm very excited to bring you this episode on VR, virtual reality. I think it's fair to say I've got the VR bug. I got bought a PlayStation VR for Christmas, and it was just an incredibly entertaining experience. I was immediately struck by the potential of it, what could be achieved with it, how it could be improved, what other things it could be used for outside of, entertainment and gaming and things like that. So I sought out industry leaders on this. I wanted to find somebody who was right in the thick of it, pushing the boundaries of this technology, investigating the social implications of it, and that's when I came across Jeremy Bailenson. Jeremy's a professor of communication at Stanford University. He founded the Virtual Human Interaction Lab. Thoroughly smart guy. Really enjoyed speaking to him. I picked up a copy of his book, which is called Experience on Demand: What Virtual Reality Is, How It Works, and What It Can Do, and I can't recommend it enough. So we'll be touching on many of the things covered in his book on this podcast, and I really enjoyed it. So if you've enjoyed hearing from Jeremy, you can find out more information about the work that he does on Twitter at StanfordVR. Also, if you want to find out more about the Virtual Human Interaction Lab, they have a website at vhil.stanford.edu. I found this conversation absolutely fascinating, so please let me know what you think. You can keep up to date on the podcast at gspellchecker.com. Enjoy. It's a great pleasure to welcome Jeremy Bailenson to the GS Podcast. Jeremy, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Stephen.
Entirely my pleasure. How are you?
I'm doing just fine.
Excellent. I was just saying to you before we started, I absolutely loved your book on VR. It's called Experience on Demand: What Virtual Reality Is, How It Works, and What It Can Do. Before we get into the particulars of that, how do you answer the question of what is it that you do? When people come up to you and ask you what you do, how do you describe your work?
It's funny. Imagine you'd met me in 1999 when I first dedicated my career to virtual reality, and you said, Jeremy, what do you do for a living? And I say, well, I build virtual reality and I put people inside and I test to see what VR does to the mind. You'd probably end that conversation fairly quickly. But what's fantastic is now, as virtual reality is becoming more of a consumer product and more in the zeitgeist of the public opinion, I get to talk to people like you who I have a huge reach and, to tell you what I've learned about VR in the last 2 decades in terms of how it affects the brain, what applications work, which ones don't, how it changes learning, communication, entertainment.
Sure. Maybe I'll just briefly tell you about how I sort of got interested in the idea. I'm a very, very recent convert. It's probably not an unfamiliar story. I read Ready Player One, the sort of dystopian adventure VR story that's now been made into a motion picture by Steven Spielberg, and I really enjoyed it as a piece of escapism. And being a massive nerd, born in the 80s, this pop culture VR sort of wish fulfillment kind of spoke to me a little bit. And I must have hinted heavily about this a few times because I got a PlayStation VR for Christmas. The pure escapism of being Batman for the day or flying in an X-Wing, he's great, but I was more or less immediately struck with the potential of it, what it could be, what else it could be used for, and what the ethical implications of everybody logging into this virtual reality world is. So I sought out your book, and it seemed to touch on everything and all the questions I'd been asking. So I suppose I think maybe to try VR is to accept it is something different, but many people haven't tried it, and many people will consider it perhaps another gimmick. We've seen plenty of them come and go over the years, and I was wondering how you distinguish what VR is from things that are generally associated as gimmicks in the computer gaming world. I think you talk a bit about psychological presence in the book.
Yeah, before we get to what makes VR special, I do want to talk a bit about sci-fi, because for me, how I get to VR is in the year 1999 when my PhD was in cognitive psychology, and I was building mathematical models of how people formed categories and did reasoning, and I wasn't in love with that field, and there was frankly people who were better at it than I was all around me. And at the time, I decided to reread this novel called Neuromancer. I don't know if you've read Neuromancer, but it is the original VR Bible Bible written by William Gibson, beginning in the late 70s. He's beginning to write this. It comes out in the early 80s. And it's this amazing journey of, in a world where everyone's using VR, what's possible in terms of how people exist, how they communicate, how they identify as people, how they learn. It's just a really amazing novel that actually caused me to seek out jobs in VR and to leave the field of cognitive science and actually take a postdoc at UC Santa Barbara, where for 4 years I learned how to build the hardware and the software to program VR. So my journey actually begins with sci-fi as well.
Yeah, I actually added that book to my reading list upon your referencing of it in your book on VR. So how do we describe the experience to people who are yet to sample the world of VR? How do we sell them this idea that it's not just a gimmick, it's not just another entertainment fad?
Yeah, and so first, what I will say is that I suspect a lot of our listeners have tried some VR, or some portion, and a lot of them probably walked away thinking it was a little gimmicky. And I still think most content that people do in VR probably doesn't need to be there. So, what makes VR special is the scene responds to your body. Instead of looking at a screen, you take a step forward and you approach something. Or if you want to talk to someone, you open your mouth. If you want to touch something, you reach out your physical hand and you feel vibrations. The way humans have existed for hundreds of thousands of years is every time you move, there's a perceptual update. Sounds get louder. Your feet feel force against the ground, the optic flow, the things that you see change. And what makes VR special, it's not the stereoscopic vision necessarily, it's not the resolution or the field of view, it's that you're using your body to naturally interact with the scene. And this leveraging the motor sensory cortex, all of the brain areas that humans have always used to interact with the world, now instead of passively watching media, we are inside of the medium. We are walking, we are touching, and the fact that it responds to our body, in my opinion, is what makes it night and day different than other things that we would call gimmicks, things like 3D TV or, super high definition, which didn't change the world compared to normal television sets.
Yeah, I mean, I think you talk about the fact that people can be fully aware and briefed and informed about what they're about to go into. They know it's not real, but within moments of them putting on the equipment, they suddenly treat it as a actual experience, don't they? There's this idea of psychological presence, that you are there and you are experiencing these events as they happen. There's
a demonstration that I've been giving since 1999 and that other pioneers were giving long before I came on the scene. It's called the virtual pit. And what happens here is you're put on the goggles and you're in a 3D model of the room and it looks just like the room you were in. And that looks great. Then you hit a button and a chasm opens up. The chasm, it's about 10 meters deep. And in order to get to the other side of the chasm, it's about 3 meters across. And we put a very rickety plank over it. So if you're kind of envisioning this, you've got to step onto a thin piece of wood and walk a few meters across this chasm to get to safety. And the front of your brain, when you're doing this, says, oh, this is not real. There's no actual hole in the floor. But when I ask people to step onto that little piece of wood, there's a substantial proportion of people that won't even take that first step. They refuse to even step on the plank because the front of your brain, the more evolved frontal cortex that has all of our humanness and all of our rational reasoning, says it's okay, it's not real. But the back part of your brain, the one that's in charge of keeping us alive, has not yet evolved to understand that compelling virtual reality that responds to your body and looks real and has virtual spatialized sound and touch. It doesn't know that it's not dangerous. And so for the people that do step on the plank, I then ask them to take a step off, to literally turn around to the side and to take a big giant step off of that chasm so that they would fall into the space below. And most people actually won't do that.
Yeah, I think I might be a bit hesitant myself. I have also made that mistake of trying to lean on the virtual reality table that actually doesn't exist within my front room. I think you only do that once.
I know. So I just wrote an article for Slate.com on my 8 rules of safety for VR. And, one of them has to do with things like that. And I've been doing this for 20 years. And I literally 3 days ago smashed my head against the desk because I forgot that the physical desk was there and I wanted to look down at something closer. And it's, this is one of the things we have to worry about, is that VR is so compelling, you completely forget the physical room is there. So one of the the side effects of presence in VR is absence from the physical world.
Yeah, so I suppose one of the issues we have there then, and I'm not sure how it's going to be solved, is this idea of free movement, being able to roam as you would in everyday life. And there's been various accommodations made, such as being able to teleport, being able to, hold a button and move forward, and that can cause a little bit of motion sickness. There's been various contraptions that have been made, sort of omnidirectional treadmills that you mention in your book. And I was just wondering, what do you think is the best solution to this issue of space?
Well, first of all, I'm just thrilled that you got to chapter 10. So many people interview me. They read the first few chapters. And so thank you for getting to the end. That's awesome.
I love the book. Seriously, I've been recommending it all week to people.
That's fantastic. So there's a few ways to think about. So the crux of the problem is that VR virtual scenes are infinitely large as well. They should be. How awesome is that? In Ready Player One, the Oasis can be huge, and the metaverse can be huge if you're reading Snow Crash or the Matrix when you go back to Gibson's work. And the whole point is that we're not constrained by physical space. The problem is that most people don't have huge rooms with really high-end tracking systems that can let you walk for a kilometer as you want to traverse a really cool area. So how do you make the physical spaces big enough to accommodate these virtual spaces? And so the answer that the industry has settled on, which is surprisingly feels good, is teleporting. So the worst thing you can do is to actually translate the viewpoint for someone. And let me tell you what that means. If you hit a button like a joystick or an arrow instead of walking, and you see the scene adjust, meaning the world rushes by you as you go from one spot to another, this is very disoriented. I can tell you why from a brain science standpoint that this happens. But when you see the world moving and you're not moving, you get very nauseous, the same way some passengers can't sit in a car. So the way that people solved this in current VR games is simply by giving you a teleport button where you point to a spot, and then instead of seeing yourself go from point A to point B, you just magically show up in point B. And with the right kind of transition, this is surprisingly not jarring. And this is one of people always ask me, well, what surprises you about VR today? I'm surprised that feels as good as it does. So the game designers have done a really good job of doing that so it doesn't get you busy. Other solutions are the omnidirectional treadmill, which is just what it sounds like, a treadmill that can basically shift its direction based on how you orient your body so that the treadmill moves around so that you can always be walking on it. And those are okay. They're still not really ready for prime time. You've got to be strapped in, and those don't yet feel comfortable. Military has for a while been using the very large hamster balls. So if you think about a huge sphere that you're inside of, if the sphere is large enough, it feels flat even though it's curved, and like a hamster, you run and it spins, and that's another way to solve the problem. One of my favorite ones to talk about is it's called redirected walking. And so here's a conceptual piece, and listeners may need to pull out a pen and a paper for it, but imagine you're in a square room and you start out in a corner, and as you're walking from the corner, we subtly shift the orientation of your viewpoint a tiny bit to the left. What you then do is you turn to the right to accommodate for that, but we do it so it's such a small adjustment that you don't even notice that it happens. And what psychologically happens here is that you are walking straight from a perceptual standpoint. In other words, you see yourself walking straight, but you're actually walking in a circle. So as you take a step, the scene adjusts to turn you to the left. You turn your body to adjust subconsciously to go to the right, and you feel like you're walking in a straight line, but you're actually just hugging the perimeter of the room in a circle. And this is called redirected walking, and there's been some neat studies on that.
How large does the room need to be to keep the integrity of that illusion?
Large enough such that nobody's really done it outside of the laboratory. The way that people tend to do it is they tend to make, the shape of the room that you're in is a really weird and complicated space. So when you walk to one end and you look out a window, they'll actually reconfigure what the room would be so that when you turn around, you've forgotten the original configuration and you actually walk in places where you get to use the room in a clever way without really realizing that you've, broken the physics of the virtual room because it was just a really confusing design to start out with. But yeah, your intuition was a good one, which is to make the circle and a square one work, you've got to have, at least a 10-meter cube.
Okay, so you spoke about your lab there, and I'm fascinated about what that might look like compared to my little consumer unit. I mean, what kind of distinctions would you make there between the kind of technology and equipment you're working with versus what's currently available to retailers now?
Well, when you think about when you have virtual reality, there's really three components to it: tracking, rendering, and display. And I'll talk about those individually. Tracking is a fancy word for measuring your body movements. And, my lab has a really expensive system that can track your body movements, your physical body movements, to 1/10 of 1 millimeter accuracy. It costs six figures. That being said, the HTC Vive system, the Lighthouse system, that can track to about 0.5 millimeter, and in a space that's not quite as big, but big enough so that you can do most scenes. And the fact that we can track so accurately is not as critical a difference anymore. So a year ago, I would have said that come to the lab because we've got this really intricate tracking system. We can track not just your arms, but your arms and your legs. But to be honest, commercial systems are getting pretty good at that. On the rendering side, we used to, here's a story when the first the first National Science Foundation grant we had funded, my advisor at UCSB wrote, we budgeted in for $100,000 for these silicon graphics workstations in order to render, which is a fancy word for to redraw the scenes, so that when you take a physical step forward, we need to draw the sights and sounds that are appropriate for that new location. You've got to do that many times per second. That's called rendering, and we used to have a $100,000 machine to do that when I first started. Up until 2 years ago, we still needed a really good desktop computer, so we were still spending a couple $1,000s with a high-end video card. We are now running just about every demo we run in my lab off of a high-end gaming laptop. So the rendering, it used to be you'd have to come to the lab for the heavy computers with the best video graphics cards on the planet. We now run it off a laptop. So the final phase of VR is called display, and that's basically what you use to change the senses. And for vision in my lab, we either use the Oculus Rift or the HTC Vive, so there's no fancy goggles that we have. What we do have in the lab, we have a 24-channel ambisonic sound system such that there's 24 speakers that by moving volume differentially through that set of speakers, sounds kind of move around the room, which is very special. So in VR, if you see a bird fly by, the tweets come from the bird as it flies by your head. In terms of virtual touch, we've got a floor that shakes, that booms up and down and can actually move your legs. So we've got this amazing, we're here in California, we've got an earthquake demo where we use VR to train you for what to do in an earthquake, and the whole floor starts to rumble as the quake happens. We also have devices that give you force feedback on your hands so that you can actually feel resistance as you, if you put your finger and you take it and push it in your chest, your finger doesn't go through your chest. And VR, when you touch an avatar, your finger goes right through it. So if you use these motors that give you resistance, it feels as if you're touching an object that's not there, which is really neat. And we just started doing some work about scent. If it's interesting, I'll talk about, we just published our first study using virtual scent about eating donuts.
I was just wondering then whether you've ever jacked an iPod into that speaker system of yours.
I've got in my lab, I've got about 20 undergrads and about 5 PhD students and a number of master students, and I don't know what they do in the evenings. I hope they have fun and watch some movies and listen to some music, but I don't have time to do it myself, but I certainly hope they are.
So the VR's got this huge capacity for entertainment, but you also talk a lot about practical applications of it. I think you use this phrase in that respect, that mistakes are free in VR, so people can use it to gain skills or improve on techniques and things like that. Maybe you could speak a little bit about how VR might become important in that respect.
Yeah, and for me, people often ask, what's the killer application in VR? I'm here in the Valley, and everybody wants to figure out where to put their investment money. And, I actually think from an entertainment standpoint, VR it's going to get there someday. But right now, movies are really good on a two-dimensional screen. Video games is probably the most successful aspect that we export out of the United States, and they work just fine on a 2D screen. I'm not convinced that news is better watched in VR than it is read from a newspaper. So, the killer app to me is not really entertainment. For me, it's about these special moments that you can't have otherwise, things that are impossible to do in the real world, things that are dangerous. And so let's go with the dangerous aspect. We have VR because because in the late 1920s, Edwin Link decided he wanted to learn how to fly, and he didn't want to do it from a training manual. So he invents the flight simulator, which is you get to feel like you're flying, and the way that you learn is you make mistakes and you get feedback on those mistakes. And there's this iterative cycle where you do things and you get feedback and you get better at your job. Obviously, if you're doing that while flying, that's not good for anybody because people die and planes crash, and hence the flight simulator. What I've done with a lot of my work is taken that model of the flight simulator and now applied it to all sorts of aspects of life. So training is a great one, and we did a lot of work with athletes. So we work with American football players, quarterbacks, to give them extra mental repetitions where they can practice to see if they can recognize the defense. We're working with the German national soccer team to help their players have a better sense of understanding the field, and to give the goalies extra repetitions to read the body language of somebody shooting a penalty kick. And there's many aspects now that have gone away from sports and gone into industry. So the largest company in the world is Walmart, and I have worked with Walmart to train literally 150,000 Walmart employees have put on the goggles to get better at their jobs. And you may be asking, well, what do you do in Walmart in VR? And again, it's about this idea of giving them an experience that they couldn't have otherwise. So there's something called Holiday Rush, also known as Black Friday, which is the day after Thanksgiving here. And you just can't prepare an employee for that. There's people everywhere running at you, yelling, screaming. It's a cacophony that nothing can prepare you for other than doing it. And what we're doing with Walmart is we've got about 20 situations just like that, really special things that you wouldn't, that you really can't train for other than being there and giving employees extra repetitions. And we've got great quantitative data just showing that people learn faster, they learn better, and they enjoy learning more when they're getting these repetitions in VR.
Yeah, so I remember, this has been a big staple of the UK's history, and I know it's always in the conversation in America. Usually when there's been some sort of massacre or tragedy, very often you'll find the finger pointed at video games, movies, often music as well. And although I don't completely dismiss the link, I think it could be possible. I often think that it's over-egged, and I think they lean too heavily on this as an explanation. But you make quite some compelling arguments in your book about how VR might be different in that respect, in the way that we interact. There's almost a possibility of experiencing blood on your hands in that sense. And maybe you could talk me through some of the ethical concerns you have about VR becoming more prevalent.
I'm hesitant to even say this, but I will, because you're a good interviewer and you're pulling it out of me. I just published a piece on CNN.com, I guess about 10 days ago, and you can read the piece. It's very careful and thoughtful. I specifically go out of my way to say I'm not arguing that VR first-person shooters are causing people to be more violent. What I'm saying is that I know VR works for training. I've worked with the U.S. military for 15 years, and I'm proud to do work that helps our soldiers get better at their jobs, to help them become better at understanding the field and at using equipment. And that's what VR, to be honest, we wouldn't have VR if the military hadn't funded it for 3 decades at least. My argument in the piece was that if somebody wants to learn to get better at combat, as first-person VR shooters get more elaborate and more like what soldiers are currently using to train, you're going to have this over-the-counter boot camp where people can learn how to succeed at violence and get the muscle memory to succeed. So what I wrote in this piece was not that we should regulate VR games, not that we should ban them, not that we should censor free speech. I'm not for any of that. I just came up with 3 standards that, boy, wouldn't it be fun if video game designers did these 3 things in the first-person shooters, and I can go through them one by one. The first is, let's make the physics of guns and bullets work a little bit differently in VR than they do in the physical world. Things like making, when you shoot a bullet, that it kind of goes in an arc, so that you have to kind of aim the gun in a different way in VR than you would in the physical world, so that the skills you learned wouldn't transfer. Another one is, let's have the things you're shooting at in these VR games not be humans, but let's let them be robots or aliens that are sized and shaped differently, and perhaps that move in these really intense patterns that wouldn't prepare you better to shoot at humans in the real world. The third standard was, let's make the inputs to shooting not be the same muscle movement that you do to shoot guns, so that you can basically learn how to shoot in VR by using maybe different fingers or different arm motions, and then the muscle memory for those skills wouldn't generalize to someone like me that doesn't shoot guns, so that when I picked one up, it wouldn't feel natural to me. So I've made this argument, and there's a lot of people that thoughtfully deliberated in a wonderfully two-sided way about game designers, and no, I would never play that, and let's not do that. But it also stirred up some anger from some gamers, and I want to reiterate, I'm not advocating restricting free speech, and I want these games to exist. I was just suggesting that it would be kind of fun if game designers embraced this idea and said, let's make amazing games that also are a little bit different from how guns work in the real world. Because I know it works with soldiers.
Yeah, I mean, I when I got to that section of the book, I found it really quite thoughtful and clear what you was trying to convey with this issue, and it caused me to think, caused me to consider a little bit. I mean, talking about transferable skills in terms of guns, we don't have access to guns the same way you do in the States, obviously, with the Second Amendment. I think I've been clay pigeon shooting once, and I had to learn to look down a sight, and it was great fun. The other week, I played through Farpoint with a childhood friend. We played together. This is like it's called an alien shooter, but you actually have a peripheral that's just shaped like a gun, and you have to hold it up, and in the game you actually have to look down a sight, and it seems to be technically accurate as far as I'm concerned, and obviously that's improving my ability to shoot, and it's probably transferable in the real world to some extent. So I think them suggestions and you've made are fairly reasonable ones, and I think to err on the side of caution, or at least acknowledge we should talk about this and think about it a bit more, is a perfectly valid approach.
Yeah, and look, I got a lot of responses from people who both served in the military and played games, and they would spoke to me a lot about the differences between even guns like the one you just described for Farpoint. And I'm not saying current games are that way. I'm not positive about anything, but what I would bet good money on is, in 5 years from now, you're going to see the trend of the convergence of military expertise going into game design, which certainly exists with games now. That's going to include the better and better types of simulators that our soldiers have access to now. So my point is, there will come a time, maybe it's 30 years, maybe it's 3 years, where your point about it was helping you learn how to aim. It's going to be even more similar in terms of the structure of the devices. And wouldn't it be cool if we came up with a set of standards, not government regulated, but kind of ground up grassroots designers, let's do this, such that to prepare for that time, that we just had things work a little bit differently. And that's the discussion I wanted to start, and it certainly did start a discussion, but it's I guess I knew it was coming, but it's never fun to get that kind of mail. Well,
you speak a lot in the book about some really interesting social experiments you're able to create in VR, and there's this idea of, I suppose, empathy. People tend to understand an issue a bit more, or are more likely to fully appreciate the impact of it when they can experience it firsthand. And there's been a few situations where that's happened. You can take people into the scene of a disaster, perhaps. I think you mentioned the idea that this sold somebody on climate change in the book, to see somewhere devastated by weather effects. And how useful do you think VR is in that sense, in terms of social experiments and getting people to understand the bigger picture?
Yeah, so this is, for 15 years, this is the kind of the bread and butter of my work, which is putting somebody in a situation that they couldn't have otherwise, and feeling what it's like in a very experiential way. And so the first study we ever did in this vein was back in 2003, and we built a virtual mirror. And experientially, what that means is physically you walk towards this, you walk in the room, virtually you're walking towards a mirror, and you see your reflection. Now, I'm a white male, and so in a typical study, I would see myself as a white male, and I would move my arms in the physical world, and I'd see my reflection in the mirror, and I'd see my arms in front of me from a first-person perspective, and my legs. And then what we do is we hit a button, and you go from being a white male to somebody else. And for example, you become a woman of color, or you become somebody 40 years older than you, or you become physically impaired. And the idea is to give someone a simulation where the brain treats this new identity as the self. So the neuroscientists have been working for about a decade on this concept called body transfer. And what that means is that in VR, when you have an external avatar, a representation of yourself, after a certain number of minutes of moving your physical body around and seeing the mirror reflection update synchronously, that is, at the same time as your physical movement, the brain tends to treat that external representation as part of the self. And so we're leveraging that body transfer. You become someone else, and then you experience some hardship that's due to your race or your gender or your age, and you walk a mile in someone else's shoes while something, traumatic happens, or, traumatic is perhaps the wrong word, while you experience prejudice, I should say. And what our experiments have shown for a good 15 years, and there's other groups doing this now. There's amazing work by Mil Slater out of Barcelona and all of his colleagues, and there's a number of groups doing this. In general, when you do this transfer, it doesn't work every time. It's not a magic solution to racism or sexism, but across our studies, when you compare becoming someone else in VR to, say, doing imaginational role-playing, which is kind of the gold standard in the perspective-taking literature, or watching a video or reading case studies, in general, this transformation tends to change behavior more when it's in VR. That's
fascinating. How far are we, do you think, from a photorealistic VR? I think some of the games and experiences I've had in VR have been very impressive, but I get the feeling we're still in the sort of first generation of consumer VR at the moment, and I think obviously some of the best stuff's yet to come. How far do you think we are away from this really photorealistic virtual reality?
So there's a technology called light field capture, which is coming soon. When I say soon, a couple of years. We've got a thought leader in the area at Stanford. His name is Gordon Wetstein, and a lot of the big companies. Google just actually released a video a couple days ago of their new rotating camera. That what light field capture means is that when you take a 360 video of a scene, you can look around, but you can't walk around. If you take a 360 video and there's a lamp in it, you can't actually go to the other side of the lamp and see it from the other side. And what light field capture does is it by combining rays from many different cameras, you can actually take novel positions in the room, and you can literally, by capture a photorealistic scene, similar to how you would do in a 360 video, but to be able to walk around it and interact with objects in it. And so that's coming, but as you pointed out, that's not in this first wave. I think that's going to be a good couple of years before you see a lot of it, although there are some companies that have been premiering some nice little demos. Matterhorn is one of them. We were next to them at the Tribeca Film Festival last year. They had a neat example of it.
Excellent. So I think you touched on it a little bit at the start of the conversation about this idea. I think the phrase you used was withdrawing from the real world in a sense sometimes when you're in VR. And I just wondered what are some of the impacts that's going to have? How are we going to convince people that you shouldn't really live there full time? I think you yourself imposed time restrictions on using the equipment in your own lab for various reasons, and I'm just wondering how we're going to deal with this reality soon, where everybody will be able to sign in and go and live out any fantasy they wish and not deal with what's actually happening in the real world.
So I don't have an answer for you. Let's start there. In my lab, we've got a 20-minute rule, and it's we run studies on many participants, and they come in, and typically our study is less than 20 minutes. If it's more than that, they take a little break. And I have a piece coming out for Common Sense Media. It's a nonprofit that basically helps parents understand, what's good for children, what are things that you should try to avoid. And it's a really common sense organization. The name says it all, in the sense that it's not alarmist, and I like them. And so I help them write this piece about what we know for VR and kids. And one of the things that we did there is I reread through all of the warning labels from the various companies about how long you should be in. And I do think that the companies are being pretty thoughtful as they come up with their guidance. But in general, I haven't seen much yet that's that's worth spending more than about 20 minutes in it. Maybe your experience has been different. Some of these games can draw you in. We had the Guinness Book of World Record breaker just stayed in for 36 hours. You can watch the video that he when he comes out on YouTube. He says, "I can't feel anything below my neck." So that's not a scientific data point, but that's
big red mark on the forehead.
Yeah. There was a paper published in 2014 with two German psychologists from the University of Hamburg, where one carefully watched the other while he spent 24 hours inside of virtual reality and documenting all sorts of responses psychologically throughout the process. And towards the end, second half of this experience, the scholar was having a hard time understanding which events were occurring inside VR, which ones outside of VR. So, in the United States, and I've been to the UK a number of times recently, and I think the same thing is happening there. It seems as if on the streets, people's legs don't work unless their thumbs are moving, meaning that they can't walk unless they're texting. Most of our listeners right now will probably acknowledge that they use their smartphone a bit too often and think about it too much, and it's the first thing you check when you wake up and the last thing you touch when you go to bed. And I can personally say for myself that I wish I was able to regulate my use a little longer. And with VR, as they hint at in the movie you mentioned to start out on Ready Player One, when every social networking event feels like the best party you've ever been to, and when online gambling feels like Las Vegas, when pornography feels like sex, how does society function? And I don't have answers for you other than I just tend not to be alarmist about this stuff. So the book has now been reviewed by the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and Nature and the Times of London, and the response has been quite good, except I've been criticized. About half of those venues have criticized me for being too optimistic and not tunnel visioning on these downsides. And I am optimistic. I really think people are going to be fine, and that people just want to be outside. VR is not that good. So I'm personally not terrified, although I don't want to minimize it, and I want us to think about it. So I just gave a talk at one of the biggest tech companies that are making VR. I won't tell you which of the 3 or 4, because a couple days ago, and I looked at the room, because I had 300 people in the room here, and these were the people responsible for bringing VR to the world. And I said, please, I am begging you guys. I'm begging you here. I came up with 7 things I wanted this company to know. And I said, can you please make VR not work in a moving car? And I said, I'm not talking to the software folks. I'm talking to the hardware folks. I want the accelerometers in the devices to burn some fuse, or to break some circuits, such that literally, if you're going more than 3 miles an hour, that VR doesn't work. And I said, imagine you could go back in time and you could make a smartphone not work in a car. Would you do it? And now on the flip side, we all love talking on the phone, even when we're hands free, because you can get your phone talking done. And certainly passengers should be able to talk on the phone. However, in the U.S., 9 people per day die from distracted drivers in 2017. And if someone has lost a loved one to a distracted driver, I suspect that she or he would be willing to not be able to talk in the car. Now when we go to VR, you would never think somebody would wear VR goggles while driving. However, we have a data point here. The data point is a video game, Pokemon Go, which is an augmented reality game where people kind of hold up a tablet and they can see real-time video, and they see an overlay of these Pokemons running around there. And there were numerous car accidents in the United States where people who were driving while playing Pokemon Go, including somebody that actually smashed into a cop car. So we know that people have done this, and I just don't want VR to work in moving cars.
That's a really interesting point that I hadn't considered, actually. And we have a huge... Well, not necessarily as big a problem with people texting or using, screens in the cars. It's actually illegal in this country. I don't know how that works in America, but they crack down on it quite heavily in the UK. And I think that's further compounded by the fact that America's mostly automatic cars, isn't it? Where we're manual. I think you call it driving stick in the States. So in the UK, plenty of the time when people are driving, both hands are occupied in a sense, so it's a little bit more difficult to do. But I think driving in America, most of the time you can have one hand free. Am I right in thinking that?
Well, it sounds like you've got the right thinking on both guns and phones, so I applaud you for that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Something which I thought was really interesting and quite cool was this idea of using VR to treat people with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And I was especially amazed by the case study you gave in the book of a survivor from 9/11. And I was wondering how useful VR is going to become in terms of psychology and medical applications in the future.
So the way you treat PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or the one of the canonical ways is called cognitive exposure therapy. And the idea is if you've had this traumatic event, for the therapist to heal you, she has to bring you back to that event. So mentally, you've got to go back there so the therapist can give you coping strategies and can untangle some of the associations that you have there. So the issue is when you've had a traumatic event, you don't want to go back. It's a painful thing. And when a therapist asks you to imagine what it was like to be on the battlefield or to be, in the towers during 9/11 when the towers came down, for obvious reasons, the patient doesn't want to go back to that trauma. What virtual reality does is it takes this imagination event and it makes it tangible. So you can build the battlefield. So Skip Rizzo, when he treats his patients down at USC that have got PTSD from Iraq, he's got a visual, auditory, and he even uses scent. So he's got a machine that can create scents that are on the battlefield. And the idea is to really bring you back so that with a therapist present, I can't say that strongly enough, you do this with a therapist to guide you through. The therapist then can use this journey, this visceral return to the source of your trauma to help you overcome it.
That's excellent. What is the next big thing here? What's got you excited? You're right in the thick of it, right at the the tip of all the innovation in that field at the moment. What's got you really excited at the moment?
So one of my passions and my hopes and dreams for the last 20 years in this field has been able to perfect what in the book I call metaphorically the virtual handshake, which is we go to work to have meetings because there's something special about being around another person. And first and foremost, let me say I don't want to take people away from loved ones. I don't want to stop you from going outside. I don't want you to stop going to parties. I still want you to go to work for important meetings, but how many of us drive to work or get on the subway in a crowded train and spend an hour going each way, and then we get to our desk and we pound on a computer for 8 hours and then we go home. And there's so much travel that uses fossil fuel, that reduces productivity, that increases road rage. There's so much travel that's just simply unnecessary. But the reason we do it is because for those couple of meetings that you have during that workday, that 20-minute meeting and maybe that second meeting, being with someone is special, and there's this social presence, this intimacy that occurs when people are in the same room together that video conferencing is simply not good enough to do right now. Now, with VR, you can do things like have better eye contact and better nonverbal behavior so that people really feel like they're in the same room. And, so there's been a slow journey that a number of scholars, dozens of people around the globe have been working on for quite some time, which is how do you create this kind of special sauce, this intimacy that occurs when people are around in terms of facial expressions and hand motions and eye contact, such that you can build a VR simulation that's obviously not as good as being in the same room as a friend or a loved one, but for a work meeting, it's good enough such that you can get rid of that commute.
One of the big issues then, I suppose, with digitally created humanoid-shaped people, especially in the movies, is the uncanny valley and this idea that the closer you edge towards human inflections and looks, with it not being quite right, it can cause a feeling of disgust within the viewer. And I was wondering, do you think VR will be able to overcome that in terms of we may be more of accepting of it because we feel like we're in a 3D space rather than observing it on a screen?
So creating virtual humans that have a negative response, we call this the uncanny valley, where it's just something doesn't feel right. It comes from a roboticist named Mori in the 1970s wrote that we love robots the more realistic that they get, but at some point they get to be so close to being human but not quite there that the like drops down into this valley because you've gotten almost human, but you're not quite there. So what we know experimentally from the valley, the best data set when you look across all the studies that have been done is that you get the uncanny valley when you combine in a disparate way photographic realism and behavioral realism. So when you've got really high photographic realism, it looks perfectly human, but the behaviors are a little bit jaggy or don't actually look human-like. That's when the valley occurs, which is when there's a mismatch. And so when you think about some of the famous Pixar films, why in Toy Story do they have toys as opposed to more realistic versions of people? And one of the answers, of course, is that's what the storyteller wanted to convey. The other is, from a graphic standpoint, they knew they couldn't do perfect animations back then, so they chose toys that don't have that many features. And in general, I think the way to avoid the valley is by creating virtual characters that, if you don't have great movements, then you've got to reduce the photographic realism, how real the appearance of the body looks, to match that reduction in behavioral realism. So try to make it look and behave equally real.
Yeah, I think cinema's edging closer and closer to solving that problem. I think the one of the best examples was probably the latest Blade Runner film with the digital Sean Young. I found that really quite impressive. I don't know if you saw that yourself. Yeah,
agreed. I think in non-real-time stuff, Hollywood's got it nailed. For real-time stuff, when you can't render, when in VR, you only have 1/90th of a second to render a frame, or actually 1/180th of a second when you actually talk about left and right eyes. And in Hollywood, every frame they render for hours and hours and hours because they don't have they have the luxury of being able to do it offline.
You make this comparison between movies and VR in the book, in the sense that the perspective you're given in a movie, I suppose, is an objective perspective. The director points your eye at what he wants you to see, and in a sense, what they want you to feel in that moment. And VR is different in that sense. And do you think VR in that way can create a more profound experience than movies, or do you need a director sometimes to basically keep your eye trained on what they want you to see?
So we're all trying to figure out storytelling in VR. I've got two pieces that are going to premiere at the Tribeca Film Festival in 1 month, in April 18th. We've got two pieces. One is called Thousand Cut Journey, and it's about when you are Black. Over the course of your lifetime, you experience all these small microaggressions and experience racism over the course of your lifetime. So this is a journey where, you start out as a child, and then you become a teenager, and then you become an adult. And at each phase of your life, you've got a Black body in this simulation. You experience, ostracism and differential treatment from police, and it's a really intense journey. And, for that piece, it's really hard to get people to look in the right place. When the police officers come over and tell you to get on your knees, it's sometimes someone's looking in the wrong spot. Managing this idea that in VR you can look wherever you want, whenever you want, and sometimes you miss what the director's trying to show. We haven't solved that. I will tell you, when everything clicks and the person is looking in that perfect right spot and all the action happens organically, it's a really intense moment. It's just sometimes you miss that in VR because somebody's just looking in the other direction, or they are so consumed by looking at the wheel of a car where the reflection looks really neat, they miss the important action. So it's a big challenge, and my group certainly hasn't solved it.
Well, I'm definitely sold on it. As someone who was quite skeptical of the idea of it, I think I fell into the camp of somebody who just dismissed it a little bit to be as a gimmick or the latest fad. But I think to experience it is to be a convert, I think. And I really enjoyed your book, and it really ticked off all the questions I had. And so I'm very grateful for you for coming on the podcast and talking to me, Jeremy. Is there anything else at all you want to get across before I let you get back to your day?
I just want to thank you for the work you do. I really appreciate how thoughtful you are, and I look forward to continuing to listen to your work.
That's really kind, man. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to the Godless Spellchecker podcast. The podcast is a one-man operation produced in my spare time away from my day job, and I love making it for you. If you enjoy what you hear, please consider lending some support. The show is entirely listener supported. I don't sell anything, I don't run ads, and given the alternative and unpopular focus of my content, it's very unlikely to find a sponsor. So there are a number of ways you can support and chip in and help improve the show and give me more time to produce more content. You can become a patron supporter and pledge a monetary amount per month or per episode by visiting patreon.com/gspellchecker. If you can't lend monetary support right now, don't worry, there's other ways you can help the podcast too. You can share it on your various social media networks, or take a moment to leave a review wherever you listen to it. Your support is massively appreciated. Thank you. Think we've all learned something here today?